The oppressive humidity of the Mexico City morning clung to Daniel Ruiz like a shroud. At 47, the lines etched around his eyes spoke of countless sleepless nights and close calls, each a testament to his 2 decades as a DEA agent. Today, however, felt different. This wasn't a raid, a chase, or an interrogation. It was a funeral, a meticulously planned infiltration into the lion's den. His target. Mateo El Verdugo Ramirez, a cartel hitman whose legend was as bloody as his body count. The intel suggested Ramirez was dead, killed in a rival gang skirmish. Daniel's mission, code-named Requiem, was simple: confirm it. Simple, yet fraught with 1,000 ways to go sideways. He adjusted the knot of his expensive, borrowed tie, the silk feeling alien against his throat. The address provided led him to a grand, iron-gated compound, a stark monument to cartel opulence. A heavy, ornate church door loomed ahead, the muffled sounds of a somber organ leaking out, pulling him into the heart of the beast. The massive oak doors groaned inward, swallowing Daniel whole. Inside, the air was thick with the cloying sweetness of lilies and the heavier, metallic scent of expensive cologne. It was a cathedral of shadows and whispers, a Baroque masterpiece turned into a cartel stronghold. Stained glass windows, depicting saints in various states of martyrdom, cast fractured light across polished marble floors, illuminating the faces of men and women who, despite their outward solemnity, radiated a palpable undercurrent of menace. Every pew was filled, not with grieving parishioners, but with hardened enforcers, their tailored suits barely concealing the bulges of hidden firearms. Daniel felt the walls closing in, the sheer number of hostile eyes a physical weight on his chest. The vaulted ceiling, soaring high above, offered no sense of release. Instead, it seemed to press down, amplifying the hushed murmurs and the distant, mournful organ notes. He was a single sheep in a wolf pack, and the claustrophobia was a living thing, tightening its grip with every measured step he took deeper into the church. Every detail of Daniel's disguise had been painstakingly crafted. The tailored, slightly out-of-fashion suit chosen to blend with the cartel's senior, less flashy members. The expensive watch, a gift from a fictitious grateful client. The subtle silver cross around his neck, a nod to the local culture. Even the faint scent of a specific cologne, often favored by a certain demographic, was deliberate. He had spent days studying family trees, rivalries, and internal politics, memorizing names, faces, and fabricated shared histories. He was Ricardo Chavez, a distant cousin from Oaxaca, here to pay respects. Yet beneath the meticulously constructed facade, a tremor of doubt ran through him. This wasn't just another job. This was a personal vendetta against Ramirez, whose ruthlessness had touched too many innocent lives. The weight of his own past, the faces of those he couldn't save, pressed down. He adjusted the lapel of his jacket, his fingers brushing against the cold, familiar steel of his hidden communication device. One wrong word, one misplaced glance, and Ricardo Chavez would cease to exist, replaced by a dead DEA agent. As Ricardo Chavez, Daniel navigated the crowded aisles, each step a deliberate act of controlled vulnerability. His senses were on high alert, every rustle of fabric, every low murmur, a potential threat. He scanned faces, not just for the hitman, but for any flicker of recognition, any hint of suspicion. The sheer volume of armed men was staggering. Some stood like statues against the ornate pillars, others mingled with a false air of casual grief, their eyes constantly sweeping the room. Daniel caught the gaze of a burly man with a scar bisecting his eyebrow, a known enforcer for Ramirez's faction. Daniel offered a brief, solemn nod, mirroring the man's grim expression. The enforcer's eyes lingered a fraction too long, a cold assessment that sent a shiver down Daniel's spine, but he returned to surveying the room. The air crackled with unspoken tension, a dangerous energy beneath the veneer of mourning. Every breath felt shallow, every beat of his heart a drum against his ribs, broadcasting his presence. He was a tightly wound spring ready to snap, yet utterly still. The somber strains of a pipe organ filled the vast space as the priest, a gaunt man with weary eyes, began the service. Daniel found a spot near the back, blending into the periphery, his head bowed in a feigned act of reverence. From this vantage point, he subtly scanned the pews. He watched for anyone exhibiting unusual behavior. A twitch and overly keen gaze, a posture that screamed trained killer rather than bereaved loved one. Most of the faces were unreadable, masks of carefully constructed grief or stony indifference. Yet Daniel noticed small details. The way a man 2 rows ahead kept his hand resting inside his jacket, the almost imperceptible earpiece in another's ear. He cataloged them, building a mental map of potential threats. He also sought anomalies, a face that didn't quite fit, someone who seemed as out of place as he felt. Was there a rival, a mole, or even an unwitting pawn among them? The air thickened with incense and unsaid threats, each word from the pulpit a muffled drone against the symphony of his own heightened senses. The priest's sermon droned on, a rhythmic cadence that was both soothing and maddening. Daniel's focus, however, was solely on the polished mahogany coffin, sitting grandly before the altar. Finally, the eulogies ended and the moment arrived. A hush fell over the congregation as 2 burly men, dressed in severe black suits, approached the casket. With practiced solemnity, they released the latches and slowly, agonizingly began to raise the lid. Daniel held his breath, every nerve ending tingling. This was it, the culmination of everything. He started to move forward, a respectful pace, mimicking the other mourners who were also inching closer. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat demanding confirmation. He needed to see Ramirez's face to verify the cold, hard reality of death. The air in the church seemed to thicken, pressing in on him as the lid lifted higher, revealing the dark, satin-lined interior. His gaze was fixed, unblinking, preparing for the sight that would either complete his mission or shatter his carefully constructed world. The lid settled open with a soft click, and Daniel leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. The man lying within the satin confines was undeniably dead, a pale, still figure in an expensive suit. But it was Ramirez, not a chance. The face was similar, yes, a distant cousin perhaps, or a body double chosen for a passing resemblance, but the distinct scar above Ramirez's left eyebrow was missing. The jawline was subtly different, the nose a fraction too broad. A cold dread, far worse than any claustrophobia, seized Daniel. It wasn't just a decoy, it was a deliberate trap, a twisted game. If the deceased wasn't Ramirez, then El Verdugo was alive, and more terrifyingly, he was here. Among them. Daniel's gaze swept the room with a renewed, desperate intensity, every face suddenly a potential killer. The mourners, the enforcers, even the priest, any one of them could be the notorious hitman, watching him, waiting. The air instantly became thinner, the sweet scent of lilies now a suffocating shroud. A cold, hard knot formed in Daniel's stomach. The mission, so meticulously planned, had just imploded. Not only was Ramirez alive, but he was here, watching. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He was not an infiltrator, he was prey. The ornate church, once merely oppressive, now felt like a gilded cage. Every exit, every window, every shadowed corner seemed to be guarded by men with eyes that missed nothing. His heart hammered, a frantic percussion against his ribs, threatening to betray his carefully constructed calm. Panic, sharp and icy, pricked at the edges of his composure. He was surrounded, utterly alone in a room full of enemies, one of whom was the very man he was supposed to confirm dead. The silence that followed the coffin's reveal, punctuated only by the distant organ, felt deafening. He had walked into a trap, and the jaws of it were now firmly clamped shut. The only question was, had Ramirez recognized him? Or was he just another sheep in the slaughterhouse? Despite the surge of panic, years of training kicked in. Daniel forced himself to breathe, to think. His eyes, now razor-sharp, swept the congregation again, not just for the hitman, but for vulnerabilities. The main doors, heavily guarded, were out. Side exits. There was a smaller door near the altar, probably leading to sacristy or private chambers, potentially a way out, but also a dead end. Windows were too high, too small. He needed to find Ramirez, yes, but also a way to signal his team. His comms device was discreetly tucked into his inner jacket pocket, but how to activate it without drawing attention? He subtly shifted his weight, assessing the positions of the most dangerous-looking enforcers. The burly man with the eyebrow scar was still near the front, his back to Daniel. Good. Daniel also noted a cluster of younger men near a side entrance, seemingly less disciplined. A flicker of an idea formed. He needed to move, to blend, to observe. The funeral was a charade, a stage set for a deadly game of hide-and-seek. He had to play along, but with his own rules. As the priest concluded, a ripple of movement spread through the congregation. Daniel knew he couldn't remain isolated. He moved towards a group of men, his expression carefully neutral, a mask of respectful sorrow. "A great loss," he murmured, offering a hand to a stern-faced man with a heavy gold chain. "Ricardo Chavez from Oaxaca, my condolences." The man, a mid-level enforcer Daniel recognized from intel as El Lobo, gripped his hand firmly, his eyes assessing. "Chavez, yes, I remember, a long journey for this." His tone was flat, unreadable. "For family, no distance is too great," Daniel replied smoothly, the rehearsed line feeling like ash in his mouth. He allowed his gaze to drift, catching the attention of another man, younger, with a nervous twitch in his eye. "Times are changing, Lobo, so much uncertainty." El Lobo grunted, "Only for the weak, the strong adapt." The conversation was a tightrope walk, every word chosen with surgical precision. Daniel offered vague condolences, feigned shared memories of Ramirez's generosity, and subtly probed for information, all while maintaining the facade of a grieving relative. Each exchange was a mini-interrogation, his life hanging on the authenticity of his performance. As Daniel expertly parried El Lobo's probing questions, a figure detached itself from the shadows near the back of the church. It was a woman, perhaps in her late 20s, dressed simply but elegantly in black. Her eyes, however, were anything but simple. They were sharp, intelligent, and seemed to hold an unusual depth of understanding. As she moved, her gaze swept the room, pausing just for a fraction of a second on Daniel. A flicker of something passed through her eyes, not recognition, not suspicion, but curiosity. Or perhaps something akin to recognition of his asterisk disguise asterisk, rather than his true identity. Daniel felt a prickle of unease. He'd studied the cartel's known associates, their families, their lovers. This woman wasn't on any intel sheet. She moved with an easy grace that suggested confidence, not fear, in this viper's nest. He subtly angled his body, trying to get a better read on her without being obvious. She was too poised, too observant for a mere mourner. Was she an agent from a rival organization, or something far more dangerous, someone who saw through the Ricardo Chavez facade? His internal alarm bells, usually so precise, were now a cacophony of conflicting signals. The woman's unsettling gaze had intensified Daniel's urgency. He needed to get a message out. His comms device, a micro-transmitter disguised as a cufflink, required a specific sequence of taps to activate a silent distress signal to his team outside. The challenge was finding a moment of privacy, a gesture that wouldn't draw immediate scrutiny. He subtly moved towards the confessionals, feigning a need for quiet reflection, his hand casually brushing his left cuff. A quick glance revealed the confessional doors were mostly open, not offering true concealment. He adjusted his stance, trying to block himself from the line of sight of the nearest enforcers. Just as his finger began the first subtle tap, a large, hulking figure stepped directly into his path, blocking his view and forcing him to drop his hand. "Senor Chavez," the man grunted, a security detail Daniel hadn't directly engaged yet. "Are you not well? Perhaps some air outside." The offer was thinly veiled, a test. Moving outside would mean passing through more guards, a higher chance of exposure. "No, my friend," Daniel replied, forcing a mournful sigh. "Just a moment of private grief. Ramirez was a complicated man. His passing affects us all deeply." He smiled wanly, the lie tasting bitter. The opportunity was lost. Just as Daniel thought his chance to signal was lost, the mysterious woman reappeared, drifting past him with a casual elegance. As she passed, her fingers, adorned with a single, unostentatious silver ring, brushed his left hand, subtly pressing something into his palm. It was a small, folded piece of paper. The contact was so fleeting, so expertly executed, that only Daniel could have noticed. He closed his hand reflexively, the paper crinkling under his thumb, and continued his feigned conversation with the security guard. He felt a surge of disbelief mixed with a cautious sense of hope. Who was she? And why was she helping him? He risked a quick glance over his shoulder. She had moved to the other side of the nave, her back to him, seemingly engrossed in the stained glass window. Her posture was relaxed, yet there was a subtle tension in her shoulders, a hint of watchfulness. This was no random act of kindness. This was deliberate. He needed to read the note, but not here, not now. The security guard was still too close, his gaze too keen. The paper felt like a tiny, fragile lifeline in a sea of sharks. Daniel's hand tightened around the folded paper, the heat of it a tangible presence. He needed a moment, a second of genuine privacy. He spotted a men's room sign down a dimly lit corridor. Feigning a sudden need, he excused himself from El Lobo with a mumbled apology about the morning coffee. He slipped into the empty restroom, locking the door behind him. The air was stale, but the silence was a balm. He unfolded the paper. Inside, scrawled in elegant, precise script, were 3 words: rear exit, now. Before he could process the message, a sudden heavy pounding erupted on the door. "Senor Chavez, everything all right in there? Boss wants to see you." It was the burly enforcer, the one with the eyebrow scar, his voice thick with suspicion. Daniel's heart leaped into his throat. He had been too slow, too obvious. He had to improvise, fast. He splashed water on his face, messing his hair, and fumbled with his tie. He threw the crumpled note into the toilet and flushed. He opened the door, affecting a look of embarrassed relief. "Ah, my apologies. Too much coffee, you understand, my stomach." He trailed off, gesturing vaguely. The enforcer's eyes narrowed, but the ruse, however flimsy, seemed to hold. "Come," the enforcer grunted, "boss is waiting." The rear exit was out, for now. Guided by the enforcer, Daniel was led toward the front of the church, closer to the open coffin. He feigned polite attention, his eyes discreetly sweeping the gathering. And then he saw him, not the obvious hulking figures or the quiet, observant types. It was a man in the 3rd row, unassuming, slightly built, with a neatly trimmed beard and glasses that seemed to slide down his nose. Nothing about him screamed notorious hitman, which Daniel knew was Ramirez's most dangerous disguise. The man caught Daniel's gaze. For a split second, his lips curled into a barely perceptible smile. Then, with a casual gesture, he reached up and pushed his glasses back into place. As he did, Daniel saw it, a faint, almost imperceptible scar, a thin, white line curving just above the man's left eyebrow, almost hidden by the frame of his glasses. The missing scar, the detail that had confirmed the corpse was a decoy, was now undeniably present on this man. The world seemed to tilt. Ramirez, here, and he knew. That subtle smile, the almost imperceptible movement, was a silent acknowledgement, a chilling, personal message from predator to prey. The air in the church, already thick with tension, now felt supercharged, every sound amplified, every breath a struggle. Daniel's disguise hadn't been penetrated by accident. He had been allowed in, invited even, into the heart of the spider's web. The game had just escalated, and Daniel was no longer just an infiltrator. He was the main event. The enforcer, having delivered Daniel to the vicinity of the coffin, lingered. Other cartel members, previously engaged in hushed conversations, now seemed to pay more attention to Daniel. He felt eyes on him, a collective scrutiny that tightened his chest. Ramirez, still subtly observing him from the 3rd row, seemed to be enjoying the spectacle. The man with the eyebrow scar, El Lobo, also drew closer, his expression unreadable, but his posture radiating coiled menace. "So, Ricardo," El Lobo said, his voice low, "you knew our beloved Mateo well, did you not?" The question was a trap, a fishing expedition. Daniel's fabricated history with Ramirez was vague, designed to avoid specifics. As well as anyone can truly know a man of his stature, Daniel replied, keeping his voice steady, his gaze respectful towards the coffin. He felt the walls closing in, not just physically but psychologically. Every answer he gave, every gesture he made was being weighed, scrutinized. The option of blending in was rapidly disappearing. He was no longer just a mourner, he was an object of interest, a fly caught in a very patient web. His choices dwindled to a terrifying few: maintain the increasingly flimsy cover or make a move and risk immediate exposure and death. As El Lobo's questions grew sharper, Daniel felt a familiar vibration against his thigh, his secondary comms, a micropager usually reserved for emergencies. It was his team confirming they were in position. A surge of adrenaline coursed through him. This was it. He needed to signal them that Ramirez was alive and present and that he was compromised. The plan had a prearranged signal for this scenario, a specific, seemingly innocuous gesture. If he ran his hand through his hair twice, it meant, Ramirez confirmed, "I'm in danger." He glanced around. The priest was beginning the final blessings. Most eyes were on the coffin or on the main cartel figures near it. Even El Lobo's attention was momentarily diverted. Ramirez, however, was still watching him, a faint, predatory glint in his eye. This was his window, fleeting and dangerous. If he made the signal, his team would know. But if Ramirez or any of his keen-eyed enforcers caught the gesture, his cover would instantly shatter. It was a choice between immediate, explosive exposure and silently hoping his team somehow figured it out before it was too late. The seconds stretched, taut as a violin string. The decision had to be made. Daniel felt Ramirez's gaze like a physical weight, a silent challenge. He took a deep, steadying breath, preparing to risk it all. Just as he subtly began to raise his hand, feigning a tired rub of his forehead, a sharp, authoritative voice cut through the solemnity. "Señor Chavez, a word if you please." It was not El Lobo, but a man Daniel immediately recognized from his intelligence briefing. Alonso, El Patron Vargas, the undisputed head of the cartel, a man rarely seen in public. He stood by the altar, his eyes cold and unwavering, fixed directly on Daniel. The entire congregation shifted, a wave of nervous energy rippling through the church. El Patron's presence alone was enough to silence a room, but his direct address to Daniel, a supposed distant relative, was an immediate red flag. Daniel's hand froze midair. His carefully constructed gesture was now impossible. Every eye in the church, including Ramirez's, snapped to him. The brief window of opportunity slammed shut, replaced by an undeniable, inescapable confrontation. His cover wasn't just on the verge of being compromised. It was actively being stripped away, thread by agonizing thread, under the direct gaze of the most powerful man in the room. There was no more blending, no more feigning. He was exposed, all eyes were on him. The air thrummed with unspoken questions, thinly veiled threats. El Patron's gaze was a physical weight pressing down. Daniel's mind raced, analyzing the impossible situation. He could continue the charade, try to bluff his way through El Patron's interrogation, but the chance of success was infinitesimal. Vargas was too sharp, his network too vast. Any hesitation, any slip-up, and he was dead. The alternative was to drop the act, announce himself, go loud. That would certainly get his team's attention, but it would also trigger a cascade of violence within the church, putting not just his life but potentially the lives of innocent bystanders at risk. And his team, operating under strict rules of engagement, might not be able to intervene effectively in such a chaotic, crowded environment. He looked from El Patron, standing imperiously by the altar, to Ramirez, whose subtle smile hadn't wavered. The hitman was clearly enjoying Daniel's predicament. The woman who'd given him the note was now a distant figure, blending back into the shadows. He was on his own. The choice was stark. Cling to a cover that was already shredded, or detonate the entire situation, hoping to survive the fallout. Every instinct screamed for survival, but his duty demanded a more calculated risk. El Patron's voice echoed, demanding attention, demanding an answer. Daniel felt the cold sweat trickle down his spine. His gaze flickered a fraction of a second to the woman with the silver ring. She was no longer in the shadows. She stood closer, her eyes locked with his, a silent message passing between them. Then her hand moved, a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture towards the side door near the altar, the one he had earlier dismissed as a potential dead end. A desperate, impossible hope sparked within him. He looked back at El Patron, then at Ramirez, whose smile widened, a silent invitation to his doom. The choice was clear, yet agonizing. Bluff and face a slow, certain death by interrogation, protecting his team but sacrificing himself without a fight. Or go for the impossible escape, revealing his true identity, turning the sacred space into a war zone, and potentially giving his team the chaos they needed to act, but at an unimaginable cost. The silence stretched, heavy and expectant. Daniel stood at the precipice, the weight of his badge, his mission, and his very survival pressing down. His hand twitched, hovering between a desperate reach for the side door and a calm, resigned acceptance of his fate. The church, filled with predators, waited. What would Ricardo Chavez do? What would Daniel Ruiz do?